So the people end up in Egypt. Well, according to the story these people tell about themselves and their ancestors, the Egyptians aren't very nice to them. They make them their slaves. For 400 years, according to the story, which is a long time. And for 400 years, parents tell their children, I know things are tough. I know that we're slaves. I know that we don't have any power. I know that we don't have an awful lot of money. We can't even make basic decisions about our own lives, about our family lives. I know things are tough, but there's a God. And God and our great-great-great-grandfather Abraham made a business deal that when bad things happened, when bad stuff happened, God would come up with a plan. That when the family got into trouble, God would come up with a plan and take the family out of trouble. Now, they might have added, in almost stereotypically Jewish fashion, they might have said, well, he's taking his time about it. You would think somebody as smart as God, he could come up with a plan pretty fast. But God's the plan maker, not us. And those children grow up and tell their children, and those children grow up and tell their children, and those children grow up and tell their children for 400 years, which is a long time, until somebody else shows up in the story. And that's Moses. According to the story, Moses is born in Egypt not only at a time when the Hebrew people are enslaved, but when they have another problem as well, and that is that their population has grown. One of the benefits you get of taking this course, at least the way that I teach it, is that by the end of the semester, you have the components of a little miniature lecture on the economics of slavery. That's because slavery is a very popular form of labor, certainly in the ancient world, and it hasn't gone away. There are still slaves living in the world today, and I'm sure you're well aware of that. It's a very common form of labor. It's been tried everywhere in the world by all people on one end or the other of the equation. And it's a very popular form of labor. And there's an economic reason why slavery simply doesn't work. It doesn't work long term. Short term, it'll work okay, but long term, it simply doesn't work. It never has worked. That's because as a labor system, it's got a basic economic flaw. Now, I'm not at all talking about the morality of slavery. Okay. Americans are a very pragmatic people, and when we hear someone talking about something working, we tend to think that that means that it's morally acceptable, right? I'm not talking about the morality of slavery, not at this point anyway. But there's an economic reason why slavery simply doesn't work. It'll work fine short term, but not long term. And that is, it's just basic human anatomy. Human beings reproduce. Slaves reproduce. And the population of slaves is going to grow. And eventually, the population of slaves is going to grow to a point where one or the other thing is going to happen. Either the slaves get so large in number that they decide they don't want to be slaves anymore, they rebel, they revolt, and they gain their freedom through revolution. You might remember that's what the Spartans were worried about, right? Remember the Spartans? They were concerned that since 90% of their population were slaves, that the 10% couldn't control the 90%. Well, it's a very common concern because, there's all kinds of historical evidence about what happens when you have a large slave population. This is what was happening, for example, in Haiti in the 1790s, where you had a very large slave population, a very small free population, and the slaves just gained their freedom through revolution, through revolt. So either the slaves are going to revolt, or else the number of slaves gets to a point where there isn't enough work for the slaves to do, and the whole slave system becomes a drain on the entire economy. There's a cost to slavery, okay? There's the cost of the slaves themselves, which is usually incredibly high. You might be very surprised at how expensive slaves are to purchase. And then in many cultures, say the American South, you purchase life insurance on your slaves because you're spending a lot of money on them. So there's a cost of purchasing the slaves, insuring the lives of the slaves in some cultures. In every culture, providing food, medical care, housing, clothing. Nothing fancy now. Don't misunderstand me, nothing fancy, but enough to protect your investment. So you invest an awful lot of money in your slave population, and you cost a lot of money to protect that investment. Eventually, you see, the population of slaves gets so large There's not enough work for them to do, and the labor costs of the large population, it's a drain on the entire economy. That's, for example, what was happening in the United States during the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, heading into the American Civil War, where slavery in the American South was a drastic drain on the whole national economy. Well, that's another story. But there are economic reasons why slavery doesn't work in the long term, and the key is that the population grows. Well, anyway, back to the story. Moses is born at a time when not only are the Hebrew people enslaved, but their numbers are very large. And in fact, in the book of Exodus, the Moses cycle begins in the book of Exodus. Again, that word cycle is just a fancy word in biblical studies for stories. The Moses stories begin in the book of Exodus. Right in the first chapter of Exodus, Pharaoh says he's concerned about the number of slaves because he's afraid they're going to revolt. It's Pharaoh, the dictator of Egypt, comes up with a plan, and he issues a law. He issues a law to the midwives of Egypt. He says, when you go after the Hebrew people to deliver their children, when the baby is born, you look at the baby. If the baby is a little girl, well, there's no problem. But if the baby is a little boy, there's a problem. The midwife is supposed to take the baby boy, throw the baby boy into the Nile River, and let the crocodiles deal with the baby boy. No baby boys are allowed to live. That's the law. And if you think about the law, you see the economic reasoning behind the law. Okay, it makes sense economically. Again, we're not talking about the morality of the law, but it makes sense economically. You're cutting the population growth in half right from the start. You're getting rid of that half of the population which tends to be stronger and larger physically, more difficult to control physically. In general, okay, men tend to be larger and stronger than women. I don't care about your Aunt Bertha and Uncle George. That's the way it tends to be. Okay. And then as those Hebrew girls grow up, you see there won't be Hebrew men for them to marry and have stable marriages and family lives with. And so you're going to knock the population really hard. And then you let a few years go by, and then you begin to fiddle with the law. You allow some baby boys to survive and live, and then you manage the population level. That's the economic reasoning behind the law. Again, I'm not talking about the morality. Oh, well, Pharaoh runs into a problem. The midwives refuse to do it. They come up with a story that as soon as they get to the women, the women have already given birth, and they're not going to take the baby away from the arms of a mother. And so, Pharaoh takes the law and puts it on the parents themselves. Now it's the responsibility of the mother or father. When a Hebrew baby is born, then the mommy and daddy look at the baby. If the baby is a little girl, well, there's no problem. But if the baby is a little boy, well, there's a problem. The mother and father take the baby, take the baby, throw the baby into the Nile River, let the crocodiles take care of the baby boy. Well, anyway, Moses is born. Moses' mother and father look at the baby. Sure enough, it's a baby boy. Pharaoh's law says this baby has to be killed. But not Moses' mother and father. They say there's a higher law than Pharaoh's law, and they're not going to do it. But they've got a problem. What are they going to do? I guess they can pretend that Moses is a little girl for a while, but at some point somebody's going to find out. There's no long-term solution. And so Moses' mother comes up with a plan. It's a pretty pathetic plan. But Moses' mother goes down to the Nile River, and she takes the long blades of papyrus grass. We talked about papyrus when we talked about writing in ancient Egypt. She takes the long blades of grass, but instead of making papyrus with it, she weaves it into a little boat. She makes a little basket boat. And she puts baby Moses into the basket boat. She goes down to the Nile River, puts the basket boat into the river, and pushes the boat out into the river. See? Moses' mother's found a loophole. Pharaoh's law says the baby has to be thrown into the river. Doesn't say the baby can't be in a basket boat. Pretty slick. Also pretty pathetic. But it's the best she can come up with. So Moses' mother takes baby Moses, puts him in the basket boat, pushes him out into the river, and says, this is the best we can do. maybe God can come up with a plan for this little baby because this is the best we can do. Well, Moses in his little basket boat floats down the river right into Pharaoh's backyard, where Pharaoh's daughter is out swimming in the Nile River, and she looks over and says, "It's a little basket boat." She swims over to the basket boat. She looks inside. It's a baby. She takes a little closer look. It's a baby boy. She takes the baby boy out of the basket boat. She goes into the palace up to her father, the Pharaoh of Egypt, and says, "Hey, Daddy, look what I found in a basket boat out in the river. It's a baby boy. Can I keep him?" And Pharaoh says, "Sure." Well, this is the part of the story you tell really fast because, well, who saw that coming? Talk about a plot twist. 20 minutes ago, you had this poor, pathetic mother with this pitiful plan, the best plan she can come up with. Pushes her baby boy out in the river in a basket boat, and 20 minutes later, here he is, the adopted grandson of Pharaoh. Who saw that coming? You get whiplash reading the story. Well, Moses grows up in the home of Pharaoh as Pharaoh's adopted grandson. And 40 years go by. 40 years go by, and Moses learns the truth. And the truth is that he's not an Egyptian, but he's a Hebrew slave. He's lived his whole life as one of the princes of Egypt, and yet he learns the truth, that he's really not Egyptian at all, but he's Hebrew. And it's interesting how the story writer crafts the story at this point. I told you earlier that stories are important to these people, and the way that stories are told is important. Crafting the story is important. Because the writer of the story doesn't even tell us how Moses finds out. He doesn't want us distracted. He wants us focused on on the psychology of Moses in the story. We're simply told, Moses finds out the truth, that he's really Hebrew. And in the very next sentence, he goes outside, and he sees an Egyptian beating up on a Hebrew slave. And he says, "Hey, stop beating up on that slave." And the Egyptian guy says, "He's my slave, I can beat up on him if I want to." And Moses hauls off and kills the guy. Maybe a bit of an overreaction, but you see what's going on psychologically with the character of Moses and what the writer of the story wants us to focus on. Moses learns the truth, that he's really Hebrew, that he's not an Egyptian, that the people that he's been treating like slaves, well, because they are slaves, are really his family. They're really his brothers and sisters and cousins, and if it weren't for this crazy basket boat story, he'd be, number one, dead, or he'd be a slave. At best, he'd be a slave. And instead, he's lived his whole life as a prince of Egypt, bossing around these slaves, treating them like slaves, because they are slaves. And he realizes, they're my family. And this is a great psychological hit on Moses. He transfers that guilt and self-hatred onto the Egyptian. He walks right outside, sees an Egyptian beating up on a Hebrew slave, and he kills the Egyptian. Well, Moses is seen. Somebody sees him doing this. He's charged with murder, and he's got to leave. He has to leave. He's got to go to a place where Pharaoh's laws don't apply. And so he leaves. He leaves Egypt and heads out where Pharaoh's laws don't apply. Where'd my marker go? There we go. He leaves Egypt. Wake up. There we go. I think we go. Oh, forget about that red line over there. He leaves Egypt and he comes out over here, right down here. And that's messy, isn't it? Well, you see that little triangle pointing down into the Red Sea? It's called the Sinai Peninsula. I think my computer's gone to sleep on me. Come on. There we go. It's called the Sinai. Sinai. The Sinai Peninsula. I believe you can make out on the modern political map over here, the Sinai Peninsula, you see the word Sinai. My pointer keeps disappearing. Here we go. You see the word Sinai over here. Well, there, it looks like I crossed it out. And what's going on here? The Sinai Peninsula. You see Israel up to the northeast. Today, Sinai is a part of the modern political state of Egypt. He heads out into the Sinai, or the Sinai Peninsula. On the map, you're able to see some satellite imagery of the Sinai Peninsula. And if it looks like a pretty barren place, well, then, yeah, it is. On the map up here, you can see the fertile area of Egypt. Over here. Up here, you see the green area, the fertile area of Israel, up here. But the Sinai is a pretty barren place. It's a place where Pharaoh's laws don't apply, and Pharaoh's not too upset about this because there's very little out there for Pharaoh's laws to apply to. Here's a pretty typical view of the Sinai. Every once in a while, a shrub and lots of mountains and rocks and sand, and that's about it. The Sinai Peninsula is named for the most significant mountain on the peninsula, Mount Sinai. And on the screen you see Mount Sinai, sometimes called Mount Horeb. Small point. Well, back to the story. Moses heads out into the Sinai. Eventually he makes his way to Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai, the mountain you see in the photograph on your screen, where he meets a guy at the base of the mountain who owns a sheep business. Yeah, sheep business out in the middle of the Sinai. I can't imagine it being very profitable. But he gets a job working for the guy. He eventually marries the daughter of the guy who owns the sheep business, and Moses becomes a shepherd himself. He and his wife eventually have 2 sons, and life settles down for Moses. It's a very different life than being a prince in Egypt, but he's got a life. He has a family, a way to provide for his family. And life settles down for Moses. Until one day somebody else shows up. God shows up. In one of the most visually dramatic parts of the entire Hebrew story, one day Moses is out taking care of the sheep. And he looks over and there's a bush on fire. And, or at least it looks like it's on fire. Later on in the story, we're told there's an angel hiding in the bush, and that's why it looks like it's on fire. But there's a bush that looks like it's on fire, and that catches his attention and just keeps burning all day, and it never burns up. And so Moses goes over to look at the burning bush, and that's when he hears the voice. God, right? And God says, Moses, I've come to tell you that I've come up with a plan. And Moses, in almost stereotypically Jewish fashion, might say, well, it's about time. We waited long enough. What's the plan? And God says, well, I came to tell you, Moses, because you play a part in the plan. And Moses says, oh, no, I have a part in play to this. And God says, yeah, here's the plan, Moses. You're going to go back to Egypt. You're going to walk into Pharaoh's palace. You're going to point your finger in Pharaoh's face, and you're going to say, let my people go. And then you're going to go to the Hebrew people, and you're going to say, come on, everybody, pack up your stuff. Let's get out of here. Let's walk back to the old homeland. Let's walk back to Abraham's old home. Let's get out of here. Pharaoh can't stop us. Let's go. And Moses says, I can't believe it. Moses says, we waited 400 years for a plan, and this is the plan. And God says, yeah, this is the plan. You don't like the plan? And Moses says, no, I don't like the plan. And God says, what part of the plan do you not like? And Moses says, the plan part. That's the part I don't like. And God says, well, what's wrong with the plan? And Moses says, look, I'm wanted for murder back in Egypt. And I used to be pretty famous. I'm going to show up, walk down the street, and somebody's going to say, wait a second, that's Moses. They're going to grab me, drag me down to the police station. They're going to cut my neck up, my head off, before I ever get to say, let my people go. And even if, Moses says, even if somehow I sneak into Egypt, sneak into Pharaoh's palace, sneak past Pharaoh's Secret Service agents, and go running into the throne room real fast and say, let my people go, and then go running out before anybody can stop me. Then I go to the Hebrew people, and I say, hey, everybody, I'm Moses. Well, I've been out in the desert with a bunch of sheep, but I heard this voice that says we can leave anytime we want to, and Pharaoh can't stop us. They're going to say, man, you're nuts. You're crazy. You got heat stroke out there in the desert, listening to voices out in the desert. They're not going to believe me. They won't believe me. And God says, look, that's the plan. Are you with the plan or not? Moses says, well, man, if that's the plan, I guess I'm with it. Man. And Moses says, wait, before I go, you have to give me something. Moses says, first of all, you got to give me some tricks. You got to give me some tricks so that when I meet with the Hebrew people, they'll believe me. They'll know that that I've met you. That I'm not some crazy guy hearing voices out in the desert. And God says, okay, that makes sense. We got lots of tricks up here. Let's see. Here's a trick. And God says, you got a cup of water in your hand. Pour the water on the ground and watch what happens. And Moses pours the water on the ground and it turns to blood. And Moses says, well, that's kind of a cool trick. You can't do that at cocktail parties. Want to see a magic trick? Ooh, blood on the carpet trick. I can't do that at cocktail parties. And God says, here's another trick. Put your hand inside your shirt. Moses puts his hand inside his shirt. And God says, okay, pull it out and watch what happens to it. Moses pulls out his hand, and he has leprosy. Leprosy is a disease which affects the body by forcing the body to rot while the person is still alive, from the extremities inward. The tips of the fingers and the toes and the ears and the nose begin to rot away until that rot moves into the body cavity, and when your organs start to rot, then you die. It's a terrible disease, a horrible disease. It's called Hodgkin's disease if you're from the health sciences. It's a terrible disease, and Moses looks at his hand and sees the pus dripping off the bone and the rotten meat, and it smells like garbage because that's what it is. His hand is rotten meat. And Moses says, oh, man. And God says, you don't like that trick? Moses says, I'm not too sure about this one. It would be a cool trick, wouldn't it? Want to see a magic trick? Rotten hand. It's okay. And he is okay. It's just a trick, all right. He doesn't really have leprosy. It's a trick, all right. Because God says to Moses, put your hand back inside your shirt, and then he puts his hand back inside his shirt, and when he pulls it out, he's okay. I guess I should have told you that part, shouldn't I? And then God says, okay, well, let's see, what other tricks do we have up here? You want to, here's a trick. Take your shepherd's rod and throw it down on the ground. When he throws it down on the ground, it turns into a snake. And then God says, pick it up. When you fix it back up the snake, then it turns back into a shepherd's rod. And Moses says, well, okay, snakes are still kind of gross, but that's better than the blood on the carpet trick and the rotten hand trick. And at this point, you're supposed to be getting a kind of the comedic humor. You're supposed to be getting the comedic trigger here and the humor in the story, because you're getting set up. Again, this is how the story is being crafted. Although there are terribly serious things about this funny story about Moses and God, and the different tricks he's going to use, there are some serious things. For example, if you remember looking at those statues of Pharaoh in your textbook, what does the Pharaoh have on his head but the cobra, the snake, the serpent? And the symbolism there is that Moses has control over the serpent, can make the serpent come or go as he wants to. But the way that it's set up is in a funny story. And although there are serious parts there, the funny story is the setup, because all of a sudden things become very serious. Because Moses really doesn't think this is going to work. And Moses says to God, look, you're asking an awful lot of me. I'm going back to a place where I'm wanted for murder. I've got to leave my wife and kids out here in the desert, and who knows when I'm going to get back. And you're asking an awful lot of me. For that matter, I don't even know if I'm coming back. Because Moses thinks this isn't going to work. And Moses says, before I go, you got to tell me something. Moses says, I want you to tell me something you never told anybody before. I want you to tell me something you never told Abraham. You never told Isaac. You never told anybody. Moses says, I want you to tell me what your name is. Remember that names are important for these people. I want you to tell me what your name is. So far in the course, we've been using the word God here. But you understand what I mean when I say that God is a job title. It's a job description. That word God in English means personality that runs the whole universe. Well, that's a job title, but it's not a name. And Moses says, I want to know what your name is. If I say the President of the United States gave a speech last night, you know who I mean, but that's not the man's name. Or if I say, your algebra professor, you know who I mean, but it's not the person's name. Moses says, I want to know your name. I want to have that kind of connection to you. I want to know what your name is. Besides what you do, I want to know who you are. And at this point, God says, Moses, do you want to know who I am? I'm me. That's who I am. Now go do what I told you to do. That very emphatic, I am who I am. I am myself. It's a very emphatic way of saying that in the Hebrew language. I am myself. It's translated in different ways into English. I am myself. I am who I am. I am that I am. I am what I am. It's translated in different ways, but it's a very emphatic statement of complete self-containment. I don't need anyone to give me a name. I don't rely on others. I am myself. A complete expression of an expression of complete self-contained existence. But that statement, that very emphatic I am myself, gets picked up and used as the name of God by the Hebrew people. It's usually translated into English in two different ways. At the bottom of the screen you see the phrase in Hebrew, I am myself, I am who I am. I will be who I am, I always am who I am, that very strong, emphatic I am myself. It's translated two ways, or transliterated, I should say, not translated, but transliterated into English in two different ways. First on the screen you see from Hebrew into German, and then from German into English as Jehovah, or more directly from Hebrew into English as Yahweh. And that phrase, Jehovah, Yahweh, gets picked up and used as the name of God. Eventually in Hebrew religion, eventually in Judaism, that name will take on a special sacredness and never be pronounced in public because there's a specialness and a sacredness about the name. At the bottom of the screen, you see those 4 Hebrew letters that spell out Yahweh in English. They're sometimes called the tetragram. Tetra, you may know, is a Latin word that means 4, and gram means letters, the 4 letters that make up the name Jehovah or Yahweh. Moses goes back into Egypt. And believe it or not, God's plan works. Who saw that coming? As crazy as it sounds, God's plan works. And to make, actually not a very long story at all, you could easily read it in 20 minutes. Moses takes the Hebrew people, leads them out of Egypt, and right to the border of Canaan, in a experience which historians call the Exodus. That word Exodus comes from a Greek word that literally means to go out. Just like an exit is where you go out of a building. The Exodus, leaving slavery. Excuse me. Moses leads the Hebrew people out of slavery, into freedom, out of Egypt, almost back home to Canaan. This experience of the Exodus is remembered in the very important Jewish holiday, the Passover. The experience of leaving Egypt for the homeland, leaving slavery for freedom. And Moses leads the Hebrew people right to the border of Canaan. And then the people cross over into Canaan, where we enter another interesting and unique time period in world history, a time that historians call the time of the Judges.